Okay, so we're gonna talk about variables, and we're gonna use variables to do a couple different things. Um, Variables are like a very foundational part of programming. We'll learn a lot. We'll spend a lot more time on them when we're learning JavaScript and P5, but we can make them in Scratch too. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use a variable to rewrite our player animation block, which is right here. So right now we have this block where we say if we're pressing a key, we want to switch to the walk animation or go to the idle animation. And then if we're pressing this other key, we want to switch to the walk animation or the idle animation. So we're kind of repeating the same thing twice, which isn't very efficient. And then there's also, oh, you know what? Yeah, okay. I'll have to recreate some stuff, but there's a new animation that we added where the cat like eats the bird, which isn't in this version. But that's okay because we're going to add that in. And so before we had that as like a completely separate block, but now what we're going to do is add in a variable that lets us track the animation state. And so we'll be able to write this whole thing in a much more efficient manner. We're also going to use a variable to keep track of the score. So every time we eat a bird, we're just going to add one to the score. So there's lots of... These are just two examples. There's like a million different things that you do with variables all the time, but we're just going to learn a couple basic things to get started. Okay, so I'm going to go to create a variable. I go to the orange variables tab, and I can click this block to make a variable, just kind of like when we made blocks last week, we click make a block and you give it a name. Hey, how's it going? And once we create a variable, we can do a couple of things. We can set the variable, we can change the variable, we can show or hide the variable. So I'm going to make a variable, and I'm going to call it animation state. You can really make it look however you want. I usually put an underscore instead of a space because I'm just used to using that in different programming languages. It's kind of up to you. Once you create the variable, you can set it to either all sprites or this sprite only. So for this particular variable, we only really need to know this for the player. So I'm going to change this to for this sprite only. That way, if I want to have an animation state variable for my bird, it's okay. I can use the same name for the variable, but it'll only be inside of the bird. So this is getting a little bit more advanced. We don't really need to get to this level of detail yet, but we do have to choose one of these options. And so just think before you choose the option, is this a variable that applies to only this sprite, or does it apply to other parts of the game? So when we make the score later, that's something that is in all parts of the game and can be affected by different parts of the game. So that one is going to be for all sprites. So for my animation state for my player, I'm going to choose this sprite only. And now I have this little variable, and you can make it appear or not by clicking on this little checkbox here. So if I want to see it as I'm playing the game to kind of debug or whatever, I can turn this on or off. And I can also show or hide the variable using these blocks of code down here. And so now what I'm going to do, instead of using these events like the key press to decide which animation to show the animation, I'm going to use those values to set the current state of the animation, and then I'm going to use a separate block to actually update the animation. So it's going to be more structures but less code overall. So it's more efficient code that can be updated and changed more easily. So I'm going to make a new block with a green flag up here. And I'm going to set this variable to 0 to start. So I'm just going to, as soon as the game starts, I'm going to say set the animation state to 0. And then I'm going to add a little comment here where I'm going to set the different values for the animation states that I want to use. And this is just going to be a note. You can change this, to whatever you want, but I'm just using this as a note. So I'm going to add a comment, and I'm going to say animation states. 0 is going to be idle, 1 is going to be walking, and 2 is going to be eating the bird. So that way I can just remember what those values should be. And of course you can have as many animation states as you want. And what I'm just going to do is compare the value of the animation state variable to these different numbers. So what a variable is it's just a piece of data that we want to keep track of over the course of the game that can change. That's what vary means in variable. It can change. Some variables don't actually change, but most of the time when we create a variable, it's so we can keep track of a number or something, some piece of data that's going to change as we play. Okay, so this is all we need to do to get started. I'm going to collapse this comment, and I can always read it later. So when we start the game, we're going to set the animation state to 0, which is idle. And so now, over here, I'm going to create a new sort of animation block. So I'm going to make something similar to this, but it's going to be a little bit different. Let's actually just get rid of this, and we'll just start from scratch. So now we have like our movement code down here, and we'll make our animation code over here. So we'll start with another green flag, and we'll start with a forever. So our animation is always going to be updating. So we're always going to be checking for the animation. And then we know that if the animation state is 0, that we want to play the idle animation. So let's go ahead and put that in there. So we're going to use an if here. And then we can compare a variable to a value using one of our green operators. So in our operator section, we have these different guys that we can use. We can say, plus, minus, multiply, divide. We can pick a random number. And then these three right here are comparison values. So we can compare a number, is it greater than, is it less than, or is it equal to? And so for our first animation state, we want to compare it to say, is it equal to 0? So our 0 is going to be our idle animation. And that's what we're going to set it to when we start the game. So let's get our variable. So we'll drag our variable in here. And so if our animation state is 0, then we want to play our idle animation, which for me is just 1 frame. So all I have to do is switch the costume to idle. So that's our first basic setup. And so if I run the game, we're just getting that idle animation, and that's it. So that's a lot of steps. That's a lot of different blocks to add in there. But now that we have this set up, it's going to be very easy to change the animation state and then update the animation based on those changes. So let's continue working on that. Any questions so far? Okay. So we're just going to repeat this block. So I'm going to duplicate this a couple more times. And we'll make some changes. So for our second animation state is 1. Now I'm just going to design this animation. So I'm going to repeat, because I'm going to flip between the different animations. So I'm going to go to control. And actually, maybe I don't need a repeat. Yeah, I don't think I need to repeat yet. Okay, so I'm going to switch the costume to walk 1. And then I'm going to do a little wait. So I'll wait a small amount, like 0.1. And then I'm going to do that again. So I'll duplicate this block. And I'll go to walk 2. So one of the things that's nice about variables is we can update them to test things. So right now, when my game starts, the variable is just going to be 0, but I can actually edit the variable. So I can test it in game. If I change it to 1, now we get that little walk animation. So if I click on my variable or double click on it, I get these different little interactive states. And one of them is this little slider. And you can see if it's 0, I'm on idle. If I'm on any other number, it's just going to stay where it was before. And if I go to 1 for a second, you can see the walking. And then if I move off, you can see it's got stuck on one of those walk things. So that's one of the nice things about the Scratch interface is I can actually play with these variables while I'm running the game. Okay, so then my final state is 2, and that's when I eat the bird. So actually, let's duplicate this entire other block so I don't have to repeat this, or I can just use this again. So if my animation state equals 2, now, I don't have my, okay, I lost some stuff. So let's save this. Let's go over to my costumes. And I'm just going to go to my art. And here we go. I'm missing a couple sprites. So I'm just going to go to eat 1. I'll just rename these real quick. And eat 2. Okay. So now I have eat 1, eat 2. And so if I run my game and I set my animation state to 2, there we see that eating animation. Okay, so this block handles all of my animations, and now I just have to have events that affect which animation to play. So again, there's more structures going on, but the code is more efficient because I can introduce new animations without having to add a whole new if-else big chunk of stuff. Okay, so the event that triggers the animation state to turn to 1 is just if I have the right or left key pressed. So I'm going to put that in a separate structure. I'm going to add a little green flag clicked. I'm going to add a little forever. And this is where we're going to look for our key pressed. So I'm going to say if... actually, let's use an if-else. Okay, so here I'm going to look for a key press. So that's in my sensing section. And I'm going to say if key is pressed. And then I'm going to change this a little bit. Let's get some more space down here. I'm going to look for either key, because my character uses both left and right. So it's the same walk animation. So if you have different walk animations, actually let's set this up. Even though I have the same walk animation, I think it'll be better if I do it as one at a time. Okay. So if I have the right arrow pressed, then we can set our animation state. So I'll go to variables, go to set animation state, and I'll set it to 1. So if I'm pressing the right arrow, then I want to play the walk animation, and that is animation state 1. And then this is going to be the same if I want to do this with my left arrow. But if you have separate ones, then you'll just add another animation state. So you'll have 1 could be right and 2 could be left. So you can just add as many animation states as you need. But for me, it's the same one. So left is animation state 1, and right is animation state 1. Okay, so then if I don't have a key pressed at all, so I'll add another one of these down here. And here I'll use my not. So I'll just say not key. And then I'll change this to any. So if I'm not pressing any key at all, then I'll change the animation state to 0. So that goes back to idle. Okay. So let's see if this works. So now if I hit my right and left keys, that walk cycle starts. And otherwise I'm sitting on idle. Okay, so we have one more state. This is when we eat a bird. I might need to rewrite some of this code, but that's okay. We can just review it real quick. So when we overlap with the bird, we'll send out a signal or a broadcast, and then that'll tell us to change our animation state. So let's go over to our bird real quick. Okay, yeah, I'm missing a lot of code here. I hope I might have, that might be somewhere else, or I might have just deleted it. I can't remember. Anyway, we've got enough. We just need to send a signal when we're touching the sprite, which I already have here. If touching sprite 0, play hit sound, wait 1 second to spawn. So I just have to add in my broadcast here. So I'll go to events, and I'm gonna broadcast, make a new message, and I'll say eats bird, or no, this is bird eaten. So we hit the bird, or bird hit, whatever you want to call it. So this way we can broadcast out from the bird when it gets hit by the player, and it'll tell the player, you know, update your animation state. So let's go back to our player, and we'll just go over here, and we'll just receive this. So we'll say, when I receive bird eaten, we are going to set our animation state to 2. So there's one problem with this, which is that once we set our animation state to 2, actually this might work fine because it's just a really quick animation. Let's give it a shot. Okay. Okay, so it works sometimes and other times it doesn't. And the reason for that is because even though when we hit the animation, when we get this signal, it updates the animation, sometimes if this is looping at the same time, it's going to immediately undo that animation. So what we can do is we can put this whole big set thing in another block and just check to say, you know, if the animation, well, actually, you know what we could do? Okay, there's a lot of different ways we could solve this problem. So what we want to do is make sure that once we start the eaten animation, we don't want to trigger another animation. And there's a few different ways we could do that. We could block that here. Well, actually, okay. So here we're setting the other animation. So we could do that a couple ways. We could set something that says if the animation state is already 2, then don't reset the animation. The problem with that is then we have to make sure to reset the animation to 2 or to 0 or something, but we can do that right here. Okay, so there's different ways to do it. There may not be one perfect way to do it, but let's throw all of this stuff into one big if statement. Okay, so I'm gonna put this here like that. So I put all of my animation block into this one big if statement, and I'm gonna say I need an operator here. So we'll throw this here, and we'll throw our animation state here, and we'll say, oh, but then we also need a not block. So we are gonna say if the animation is 2, we don't want to do any of this other stuff. But if it's not 2, then we do want to do this other stuff. Okay, so that might be a little bit complicated, but basically what's happening is we're checking to see if the animation state is 2, then we don't want to change our animation to any of these other values. But if it's not 2, if it's either 1 or 0, then it's fine to do 1 or 2 first. This is basically like setting the priority for which animation should be played. There's one issue with this, which we'll see in a second. Once I start this animation, it's never going to stop. So what we need to do is, once we play the animation here, we can just set it back to 0. So we'll just set animation to 0 right here. So this way it plays the eat bird animation every time, but it goes back to idle, and so then we get the rest of our animation states. And actually, you know, it might be easier just to put this whole thing here and ignore this here. Let's see how that goes. Yeah, that actually probably makes a little bit more sense. The only problem with that, actually there's different ways to do it. I'm gonna leave it here just so all of our animation data is here. Okay. So again, there's a bunch of different ways to do this. It kind of depends on how many animations you have and then what the sort of priority of animations is. So if we start the eating animation, we don't want to switch to any other animations. We want to make sure that finishes before we switch back to the walking animation or the idle animation. Okay. Any questions? That one's probably a little bit complicated. You guys can play around with that, and we'll go over it today. The score is actually a little bit easier, so maybe we should have started with that one. But let's add the score real quick, and yeah, then we'll have some workshop time. So with the score, it's pretty simple. We just want to basically track the number of birds that the player's eaten. And so we just increment the score by 1. So we add 1 to whatever the current score is anytime we hit a bird. So we're going to make a new variable. We'll just call this score. Very simple. And this one is going to be for all sprites. So any sprite can either read this variable or change this variable. And now we're done with the animation state, so I'm going to turn that off. We'll be able to see the score here. In the second part of class, we'll go over how to actually visualize the score with our own graphics. But for now, we're just going to use the Scratch version. And basically, when we start the game, we want the score to be 0. So let's go over here. This is still in the player sprite. It doesn't really matter that much, actually, where this code goes. But since the player sprite is our main sprite, we'll add it in here. So when we start the game, so when we click the green flag, we want to set the score to 0. So I'm going to use set and then change this drop down to score. And so the score will always reset to 0 when we start a game. And when we receive the bird eaten broadcast, we'll change the score by 1. So that just adds 1 to whatever the score is. So that one's pretty simple. You can see each time I get a bird, the score goes up by 1. And if I stop, you can see when I stop the game, the score is still 11. But if I start it again, then we want to set it back to 0. Excuse me. We don't want it to stay, whatever it was. So we'll use the score to visualize it later. But we can also use the score to reset the game or change the game. So another thing I can do, after I set the score to 0, I can add a forever loop and just check for sort of an end state. So let's say we want the highest score that you can get in the game to be 10. We can ask for that. We can say if. And so we'll use our equals operator, this little green guy in here. And we'll throw our score variable. And so we can say if score equals 10, when we add our title screen, we'll go back to the title screen later. But for now, let's just set the score back to 0. So we'll go back here and set score to 0. So now, as we play the game, anytime our score gets to 10, we'll know, and we'll start the game over. So if I eat 10 birds, you can see the score gets set back to 0. Okay, so we'll use that as a mechanism to go back to our sort of splash page for the game when we add in our backdrops later in class. All right, so that's variables. There's a lot there, so we'll take some class time. You guys can play around with that. Let me know if you have any questions or you need help with implementing anything. If you get the animation state working with your player, you could try adding it to your sprite, whatever your sort of enemy or item that you're collecting, you could add that variable to the sprite as well, if you want to kind of test that out. But, you know, obviously you can start with the player first. Okay, so I'll stop this recording here.